Welcome to the UnityNow podcast, where we discuss unity in the face of division. Stemming from the Unity 2020 plan, we explore how to bring unity to America and end the dysfunctional and destructive Republican-Democrat duopoly. UnityNow is 100% volunteer run and supports the Unity movement at articlesofunity.org.
Howdy, howdy. Welcome back to UnityNow podcast. I'm Gabe Garber, your host. Today we're joined by Christopher Wells, and we're looking forward to having him on. He's had a whirlwind of the past few days on Clubhouse. We'll definitely get into that. And we also wanted to have him on to kind of provide us with a little bit of a younger person's perspective, that some Gen Z issues and yeah, I don't know. We'll get into it soon, but here, welcome, Christopher.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Of course. Before we kind of kick into it, we'll give you a chance, I guess, to maybe introduce yourself. We're all kind of, this is all off the seat of our pants in a bit of a way. So it's, we're getting to know each other right now, and our listeners will also be interested. So I'll just kick it over to you to introduce yourself. What's relevant information, irrelevant information, your call.
Well, I'm a second year classical studies student at the University of British Columbia, born and bred in the Washington, D.C. area, technically Virginia. However, when you say Virginia, people think farms and whatnot. So I like to hash that out. But at the same time, the people in the city get mad if you don't make that discrepancy. So I'm a free speech advocate, former social justice advocate, and a disaffected liberal to some extent, you could say, and also a self-declared writer. I don't have anything published yet, so I don't know if I can grant myself that title quite yet, but we're working on it.
We'll just asterisk as aspirational.
Yeah.
You gotta set the goal somewhere. So cool. I guess let's at least kick it off with the first bit. And the reason you kind of popped up on our radar was on Clubhouse in the recent days. I'm still a little bit kind of in the dark about all the specifics of it, but you kind of got a good amount of traction and some recognition and awareness. So you mind running us through just kind of the lead up to that, or what,
Yeah, so Clubhouse is, I think, if you want to take off on it, the time is now, because the normies are just getting in the gate. And I went from IDW lurker for the past 2 years to discussing with some of my biggest idols the contemporary state of liberalism from the left, but not only that, mainly issues regarding Gen Z. I'm 20 years old, so I'm right in the midst of it. And I reached out to Ricky Schlott, who I met through a Zoom meeting, and she's a student at NYU and freelancer for the Daily Wire and an intern with Megyn Kelly. And I said, I want to host a Clubhouse room on Gen Z against wokeness, which is what the liberal element has been dubbed by many. So I was fortunate enough to be in a Clubhouse room with Greg Ellis, who has started a club called The Respondent for fostering dialogue, and he let me use his platform, and I think that's how it really took off. We had Colin Wright from Quillette, Eric and Brett Weinstein, some of my biggest idols, Lex Fridman, amongst many others who I can't recall right now, but at one point, Sam Harris was in the audience, and I think I may have scared him off by noting that he had entered the room. And it it was intense. Oh, of course, DJ Hammer came in, and we started at 3 p.m. West Coast time, thinking it would go for a couple hours and maybe we'd get one notable person in there. But before we knew it, it went to 8 in the morning, and I was on till about 9 or 10 p.m. And when I woke up, I saw the same room was going. And I want to give a huge shout out to Greg Ellis for giving us this opportunity because I don't think it would have taken off without his support.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, a weird kind of tie in there. One of our former video editor and co-host is now working on one of his projects. So that was an odd connection, but a cool one. So yeah, very very wild. I understand you may have missed out on some important schoolwork because of that as well. But sometimes you just got to ride the wave.
Certainly. Well, I had a paper to get in and it was graded very quickly and I actually escaped with an A minus. So we're I was scared I was going for C territory there, but we survived.
Yeah, I mean, college isn't always about the grades. There's the experiences that it facilitates, and I guess this is maybe college adjacent, but in the time of COVID, isn't everything. So
Well, yeah, I'm quite cynical in that sense that I think universities are on their way out, unfortunately. As long as they're handing out credentials, they'll be there. But personally, I feel I've done more learning through podcasts and books and many other online realms, primarily names such as Brett and Eric. So that's the cynical side of me speaking. I don't think university is a total waste, but Jordan Peterson was on a Clubhouse room recently where he was saying at this point, take a lot of effort to resurrect the universities. And it's an interesting dynamic because I feel like there's very theoretical conversations going on in the university where students are all in their own echo chambers. So we'll pull out aspects of what we're seeing online and just throw that at the prof, and they won't necessarily know how to handle it. So what I see is universities were once the pinnacle of discourse, and so much of that discourse is happening online nowadays that soon enough there will be plenty of people not getting their credentials from universities, but making their names online. Coleman Hughes, most notably, who's a university student and someone I admire.
yeah, yeah. Well, I'm dating myself a bit. I'm 34. I got to make sure of that. But so even just I'm a bit curious of just. So you said you're a second year student. So I imagine you had at least 1 year on campus in person. I attended Indiana University, but that was like '05. So it's been 15, 16 years. So my recollection of campus life, and even that is, I led a fairly unconventional college track, but yeah, I would imagine it pretty much all of what I know about campus life today is anecdotal, and usually hearing it through several sources. So I'm curious to get a sense of what that was like for you, even before COVID, your first year, taking kind of all of that cynicism, which I personally share quite a bit of, and find it difficult sometimes to keep some level of centrism there or ambiguity in terms of the value that's offered, and I also can say that in retrospect, having earned those credentials. But yeah, I'm just curious as to kind of what your experience was like in the year that you were on campus.
Yeah, it was a very weird point in my life personally. I had come off a year of traveling abroad because I had deferred my admission, and I can really unpack that at length if you want me to go into it, in that was where much of my political shift out of what many could call the cult of wokeness occurred, and I was suffering from a very bad depressive episode and disassociation, which is essentially where trauma, which is a word I don't like to use lightly, separates your mind and body. Like I would put my hand out here and it would look like my hand was over here, kind of thing. So I had just really started recovering from that when I got to university. And I'm not sure if it's just a Canadian thing because I was born and raised in the States, but I'm a citizen here, where there's not much of a community environment at my school, just from my perspective. Even if you go to a big school like Clemson or Alabama back in the States, it's a very communal thing. People here really seem to go about their own lives. It's not the same sense of a college experience, one would say, but I would say I knew what the politically correct environment would be like. So I was quiet for my first semester until one day I was told not to speak in a class due to my white privilege. And I went and posted on my Instagram something along the lines of, I understand the concept of white privilege, and statistically there's many reasons to point to it. However, it shouldn't be used to silence students in academic spaces. And my phone just blew up with a lot of angry messages. I'm articulating that in a perhaps softer tone than I put it at the time. I think I was really resentful at that point in my life. And I would go to class and then come back and just dive into the culture war online. Like I said, I've been a long time IDW lurker, which I think speaks to something that really hit me on the Clubhouse call the other night. Is we know many of us have lost the ability to ponder. We're around great ideas at a moment's notice, but we become very good at regurgitating those ideas rather than thinking for ourselves. And I lost a lot of friends. Even a family member DM'd me something pretty nasty. And I remember having discourses with these people, and it was really like admit you're wrong, or you've lost your social standing kind of thing. And I was also slightly taken aback at how the university residents reminded me so much of high school cliques. I was expecting a lot of individuals, but I got a lot of very cliquey uh, connections. And so I was pretty withdrawn my first year. I did like my in-class experience for the most part, with the exception of a fine art course I took, where I made a poster of Jordan Peterson. I should preface this by saying that the assignment was to make a politically provocative poster, and it was Justin Trudeau putting his hand over Jordan Peterson's mouth. And this was the first time I really dived into this, and I remember walking to class like, this can't be that bad. And as soon as I stood up, really immediately dubbing down what my presentation was going to be, but nonetheless, the TA interrupted me during my presentation, spoke about how Jordan Peterson's a platform of hate, and I had already made it clear, I don't agree with him on a lot of issues, and I was failed on that assignment.
Wow.
And I was thinking that I could take action through the administration, but it might be futile and I might be putting a target on my back. So I ended up going to the prof and they bumped my grade up, but I didn't mention the fact that I had been, in essence, silenced. And when things really heated up was during George Floyd over the summer, where I posted something that was neither against or specifically pro BLM. It was a very kind message saying, I'm taking a step back from politics. I'm looking for peace. I know everyone has various reasons to be upset right now. I believe I put an MLK quote in there. I had a photo of people protesting BLM. So it clearly was not against BLM, but that's when I was hit with a true torrent. Like, it wasn't pro enough. And I ended up deleting my accounts for most of the summer. And a Vice blogger at our school, who's a cultural icon, uh, dispatched their army upon me. And I was getting just nasty messages from all over. And that's what I think is really upsetting about our generation as a whole, is when you meet face to face with these people, because people know who I am, and so on and so forth. It's not as volatile as it is online, and we've really been socialized online, even outside of the political realm. Because I got on Instagram in 7th grade, and that's when it was still really pure. You know how people speak about the golden era of Facebook, like, oh, it was just my grandmother sharing photos, and now it's my grandmother ranting about QAnon or whatever it be.
Yeah.
So it was posting things like, repost this to save this dog's life, and
I
it
mean,
was
I,
quite
I can
wholesome.
even go back to a time where, for me, it was the true golden age of it when you had to have a college email address to even be on. So it was, I mean, to see, again, going back, this was 2005 when I started college and I was on there. And yeah, 15, 16 years later, it's an entirely different beast. Like, it's hard to even compare the two, or, it's not something I dwell on very often, but even just in the context of this conversation right now, bringing it up and having me think about it and hold these two things, Facebook of the golden age, as you put it, is just like, it's wild to see how different the platform has become in a relatively short amount of time.
Yeah, and it was by the start of high school that people were really, these de facto rules around Instagram were set. And that's when we all became celebrities in our own right. Because over the summer, when I was quote unquote canceled for the second or third time, I I had this idea that the entire weight of the institution and my peers were against me, which I still think to some extent is true. You know, I can be quite a provocateur, um, but how much of that was in reality and how much of that was through these exchanges we've had online? That's what I think is really cool about Clubhouse, that I was saying is, we had some genuinely militant BLM supporters in the Clubhouse room, and genuinely quote unquote anti-woke people in the Clubhouse room. When you go on Twitter, we all live in our own echo chambers. I actually have a rule for myself that I don't unfollow anyone I disagree with on Twitter, just to try to avoid that to the extent I can. But uh, and now we were forced to speak to each other for the first time in 4 years. You know, it was when Trump was elected that this really, really polarized things. And even then, when I was in high school, because I'm from the DC area, so many of my peers' parents work on the Hill. Trump supporters and Hillary supporters could get together at parties, and some dated each other. And now it's the campus culture is so extreme that I I had people reach out to me and say, I really agree with you, but I can't speak up. I lose too much, and I lost a lot, but I gained a lot. Um, it got to a point for me when I was silent about these things that the resent built so much that I frankly am more okay with having less friends than being silent about it. It was a really painful silence to live in, and I certainly, because of the way we've been socialized, my first reactions were almost as militant as some others, or volatile would be the adjective there, that I wasn't proud of how I carried myself in initially advocating for free speech, because when you walk into the wolf's den, you can't be as angry as the wolves. And,
Yeah, and
I really want to.
oftentimes that volatility is exactly what they're looking for, because it gives them so much more to grab onto and to point towards, to say, look at this hateful, it you end up exemplifying so much, like, of an exaggerated viewpoint, and become a caricature that it's easy to point at. And it's that's one of the biggest challenges in what seems like a very asymmetrical kind of war zone, like, at times, to put it not bluntly at all, I
Certainly.
guess.
No, certainly. It's a war of ideas at this point, and that's where I got way more conservative than I think I am in reality because of all of this, and because of it pushing me further into a conservative uh, online echo chamber. And what I say is I'm left until it comes to free speech. I do think it's very important to acknowledge things like systemic racism and other issues in society. However, that was the one thing growing up was even in I remember the 2004 election very I was 4 years old, but I remember the fallout. I remember my mother's reaction, and then 2008 we had third graders getting in shoving matches over Obama and McCain, and the polarization was always there. But the one thing no one ever dared question was the First Amendment. Even in 2016, even in 2018, it only seems that in the past 2 years it's become a conservative talking point of sorts. So it's hard to suss out what is the Overton window shift, where if you're a free speech absolutist such as myself, are you conservative now? Or is it a minority of the left that's uh, for silencing what they would consider hateful opinions? It's a very hard thing to sort out. So I find many people my age saying we're politically homeless. Um, I also have an issue with being raised with such progressive values that I can't turn around and marry the farmer's daughter from Alabama. I'm quite effeminate in many regards. So the left feels like my tribe, and I think that's what was so painful about the past few years is I went on a political shift for about 2 years, but it wasn't until the summer that I really spoke up and told people how I felt. And it's also the people I once knew as centrist liberals who have embodied things that scare me, primarily the notion of equity, is a whole other bag of snakes to unpack,
Yeah.
which we perhaps don't want to turn to right now, but all sorts of things. Scientists I know telling me that gender is a social construct, so on and so forth. And again, I don't want to come across as conservative here. There are plenty of nuances in the middle. Like, I'm not anti-trans people, but I am anti-84 pronouns and compelled speech. You have people like J.K. Rowling, who were progressive heroes, taking so much flack and being called transphobes when she's like, no, that's not what I'm saying. Is I'm saying that there are trans rights and there are biological sex rights. And groups such as the ACLU totally want to blur the lines now for the sake of expediency or whatever it be. But people have been saying this issue has existed on college campuses for about a decade now. And I'm finally hearing from some liberal voices that they're finally willing to recognize this as an issue. And so we're way past that. This isn't
Yeah.
K to 12. It's in the ACLU, and now it's coming to Biden's desk.
Yeah, plenty of boardrooms across the nation as well. I mean, I'm it maybe didn't have the same specifics whenever I went away to college, but my first boss, I gave guitar lessons at a local shop, and he had owned the store for 50 some years at that point, maybe, but was a military guy, older. I mean, yeah. And before I went away, he was very vocal in warning me about the liberals who I was gonna encounter whenever I got to college. And by and large, most of academia is filled with liberal minds. It's not the far, it's not all the leftist or extreme, but it is it the level of alarm that he expressed to me at the time, especially, it was easy to dismiss or just kind of roll my eyes and just be like, that's kind of exactly why why we go to college. Like we're not all bound to end up in a very small track and in a conservative kind of, not backwards necessarily, but just limited worldview. So I mean, that was, I think, part of the excitement of going to college for most people, is to be in a world on your own. You've lived under certain orders ostensibly up until that point, and now that's your opportunity to test the limits of what you've come to know thus far. And again, kind of like what you said earlier, that's been academia. College has been the place that's been the stronghold for allowing that and facilitating that discourse. And yeah, it's, to kind of wrap that up, it's I think that level of alarm or that concern from people on the right has been, I mean, it goes back even further than just the last decade, but it's taken different forms. And I think it speaks to the degree of polarity that we've noticed, and the kind of the splitting, the team identification, kind of the tribal affiliation, and the judgments of other people based on the associations that's really motivating or kind of propelling a lot of that in, I don't know, yeah, deteriorating ways, I guess, or yeah, it's a concern. Again, from my experience a decade and a half ago, it's one thing, but hearing it beyond, or I guess it is still like anecdotally, but directly from the horse's mouth, so to speak, it's, I don't know that it is cause for any less concern for those of us who are similarly minded and espousing and trying to bring, trying to continue to cultivate the Enlightenment values, as flawed and as incomplete as they are.
Yeah, I would say to anyone who were to walk in to an English course or a social justice course or a philosophy of oppression course on a university campus now, who has not been in the academy for a decade or so, would be surprised by the cult-like mentality. It's really, because I once partook in that cult. I remember my first true experience with it being when I did a summer program with the ACLU. And I was used to being the social justice advocate at my high school. And then I came to, with the wokest people, high schoolers from around the country, all put into a dorm room together. And that's when I first had my reservations, because I remember saying something to a girl that was something about being discontent with my effeminate nature and how that works for me romantically. And she wrote it off as, oh, life's so hard for you as a straight white male, isn't it? And there's something in our generation where we all want our pain to be seen as paramount. it's almost a pain competition. And this doesn't extend just to the elements of the left, because I think that's why I was so reactionary when I first had these encounters on campuses. To some extent, many of us have been raised in a victimhood culture. And if you recall, when Trump had that uh, rally in Georgia during the senatorial races, he told all of the crowd there that they were victims. So it's not an issue that extends just to the left, because although that's where it's most pronounced, but I also see people embracing identity issues so they can get a spot in this hierarchy of victimization. I see, and I did it myself at one point. I identify as straight now, but in high school I was bi-curious, you could say, and did some sexual experimenting. And I remember really wanting to convince myself I had more of a proclivity towards men than I did in reality for this very dogma, so I could play some sort of oppression card. And this isn't to say that certain groups aren't disadvantaged, but it's how, for instance, one of the ringleaders of coming for my throat, um, their parents own several sweatshops, and they have a liquor budget of $2,000 a month. And they happen to be slightly darker than me, and all they do is speak to me about my privilege in this sense. Perhaps I'm getting too anecdotal. Don't want to name names, but it's it's very weird how these identity things play out once you're really in that cult mentality. Um, in that, even if you've been disadvantaged to some extent for your identity group, do, am I more privileged than you? Because fiscally, that's certainly not the case. And I don't really know where I'm going with this. Perhaps we should turn it
Yeah.
back to Gen Z as a whole.
No, yeah, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, I guess just speaking there, it's like you've made the point earlier, and it's one that I hold as well, that it's we can identify the oppression that's there. We again, coming from the progressive values and caring about the well-being of everyone. It's You mentioned kind of having this transformation, but I like the way that I kind of have experienced it. It's more it what feels more appropriate or more accurate in my case is that it's not that I've changed, it's that the landscape beneath me has changed, and I've, all of a sudden found myself in a completely new territory that I'm used to occupying, because what's taken place underneath me, all of the sudden, the culture that we're within, all of the moving pieces, the place where I thought I fit within that is no longer, I no longer fit there, in just kind of crude way of putting it. And so there's a recognition that, I think ultimately, like, everybody individually has overcome something. They've suffered something, and at a certain point there's, it's hard to say what the value is of trying to score or rank that, because if we're ultimately trying to communicate with each other and connect and bond and build that community, your experience is never going to map on entirely to mine, and that our ability to come together and build that connection relies on some translation to occur. And the one thing that I don't know, it really kind of struck me is, like, there's almost like you have to trust that I'm translating what you say, the symbols, the words that you're saying about your experience. You don't need me necessarily to have had that same exact experience in order to feel accepted and heard and embraced and cared for. because ultimately I could say the same thing for you. I allow, if I know that we're operating in good faith, my experiences, anything specific to that is not going to directly translate, but I allow what I speak to you to map onto whatever it is within you that facilitates some amount of connecting. And if we can't at least get to that, then it just kind of starts to feel like every man for himself, very chaotic, very, that's the thing that's the most worrisome to me, is we have to allow those people to cross those bridges. And it feels more and more at times, especially when it's more charged and understandably charged, but there, yeah, I guess that's my thing, is it feels like ultimately we have to let those people across if we want to build a meaningful, sustainable culture, community, kind of
Yeah, that I think that's the thing, is at least in the certain idea of white privilege, is that people think if you don't admit to this racialized privilege that you're unaware of oppression. And I personally, in the past year, I've overcome a lot of victimhood, because I think many of us have been raised as perpetual victims. Now, much of this doesn't faze me because I'm so used to it at this point, which is why I didn't necessarily like the attention we were getting on Clubhouse. Oh, you're so brave for speaking out, because I've been doing this for a year. And it's not, and what I hear a lot is that white privilege doesn't mean that white people can't face hardship, but I think there's an undertone there where I was really suffering when I got to school, and I felt that my pain by those close to me wasn't being recognized on racial grounds. And then I think there are a lot of people who have been suffering from systemic oppression for a long time, and they feel their pain hasn't been recognized on similar grounds. And that's what you're getting at, is we need to go back to liberal humanist values, and that there is something human that transcends everyone. And what we were just learning in my English class is that's not true, is that liberal humanism is an old school of thought under Eurocentric values and all the buzzwords you can throw in.
Yeah.
And I hear a lot too that, at least back in the day, 5 years ago, being back in the day when Jonathan Haidt first wrote The Coddling of the American Mind, which when I read, I was like, oh my God, this is me. Like, I see myself in this book. There wasn't a name. Now, Jordan Peterson's called it identity politics. Many academics refer to it as wokeness. It was said that it was a minority. And I think there's a minority that actively pushes and actively shuts down speakers, but the center's collapsed. We've become so polarized that even if people aren't going out and shutting down speakers, they're okay with it. And I particularly see this with the gender issue. I have a lot of conversations in private where people agree with me on this issue, and that can be said for a multitude of issues. So I'm fearful that it's no longer just a minority. I'm fearful that it's a full-on monolith.
Yeah. Well, even something you said very early on was kind of that it's no longer okay to think out loud or wonder. And I mean, that's something that I can attach to quite a bit. It's the asking of questions, or, expressing uncertainty at something, and trying to, have a conversation that, you're putting yourself in a very vulnerable position by exploring it. And you might say something that 3 seconds later, or 3 minutes later in a conversation, you're right back to where you started, or you're if you allow yourself to take that journey and find the right people who are willing to kind of have those conversations, it can really just expand the pool that we're drawing from, and really stands to kind of solidify or offer the ability to kind of ground your positions in something much more expansive, or maybe representative of a larger picture of the world, as opposed to something that's collapsed down and very simplistic. And yeah, again, I think it's that willingness to kind of let go of any firm position and take up a route that's full of uncertainty and self-admitted doubt. And I guess doing that, it's you open yourself up to taking a few steps along that path that are missteps, that you would even very quickly say, like, I'm not really like taking this position, but I can run my mental processes and kind of try to step into this to try to maybe better understand some of the nuances of that position. That doesn't mean that I'm supporting it by any means. There's that kind of middle ground. It's like you have to take a position, or if you aren't willing to come out directly and in support of this position, then you are tacitly against it. And there's so much of that middle ground that most people are occupying in their head all of this all the time. And by kind of forcing people to just take a stance, absent all of that kind of exercise of jumping the hurdles mentally and exploring things, that's where I don't know, you mentioned the cult, or kind of like the religious undertones can be, of where you're just firmly rooted in a position without necessarily having the same level of conviction in, or understanding of how you got there.
Certainly. I think that's the issue in how these things play out online in particular. And this is something humanity's been struggling for a long, long time. Just as somewhat of a stan of him, in one of Peterson's first big interviews, he points out that humans like simple answers to complex problems. So some of these theories, like intersectional theory or post-colonialism or sociological theories, whatever they may be, are complex. Marxism was also a complex theory. It was, to me, it sometimes would even seem more of a prediction than anything else. And how it plays out when you get a mass of people together becomes very simplified. And that's why the country's broken down into a narrative war more than, and that's what I find so interesting about living here in Canada, or I do pay some attention to UK politics, is even though there's a party line divide, the discussion is always over policy. The culture war has arrived here to some extent, but people aren't as aware of it. Although I think the woke policies have gotten far really through here, and it's such a multicultural country that people aren't as concerned with individual liberties. But it's weird to once you take a step back from the polarization or dogma or whatever you're invested in, to see the nuance and not be able to speak to the nuance. I think that's particularly true with Trump, where I'm no fan of Trump. I despise him. I despise the nationalist rhetoric, but there are a few things he did that I thought were incredible, primarily repealing 3 strikes. And merely saying that Trump did something right, I'm also on board with his China policy and the peace in the Middle East. If you say those things, and I had a conversation where someone's like, "Oh yeah, I don't know much about that, but I presume because Trump did it was bad."
Yeah.
And this is a university student. This is the level we've gotten to in our critical thinking, and I think there's so many factors, but the most mitigating factor is social media. And I mean that for everyone who's invested in the culture war. I look at it kind of on par with climate change, whereas imagine if everyone genuinely tried to live the most sustainable life they could. We may not even need that much policy to combat climate change. Now imagine if everyone, every journalist, every activist, every politician got off Twitter. How much would the culture war die down? And I'm not saying that I think that's the way forward, because individual responsibility for everyone is kind of the failing argument of conservatism to some extent. But it's something that I've been thinking about quite a bit, and
Yeah.
why I try to turn my phone off for most of the day.
Yeah, and I mean it's helpful. I mean, I definitely have a much more intentional relationship with social media than I have, in years past. And you don't want to have to necessarily jump all the way to becoming a Luddite and just, dismissing all of it entirely. But there is something, I think it speaks to that, when the whole entire world is at your fingertips, that's competing with other interests or other information that's immediately surrounding you. And the more we're pulled from our immediate lives, like, our day-to-day feet on the ground, immediate surroundings, it just expands the amount of stimuli that can pull us into spending mental energy on something that really is not going to affect us in our daily lives. And I think, again, it's hard because right now there is, there's a call to, you have to pay attention, you have to, stay up on all of this. And I agree with that to an extent, but it's also, it can't be the thing that causes, every individual to ignore their own basic needs around themselves. And it I think over time has the effect of diminishing people's idea of what they can influence in their own smaller spheres, definitely. And I mean, it kind of has to be a smaller circle of influence. And I think it's important to just continue to kind of bring attention to that and attempt to create some type of model that shows, like, okay, if I pull my attention in a little bit closer into a smaller sphere and attempt to, make some changes in my immediate surroundings, how much of that is going to impact me tomorrow, and how much of that over time, if you set that as a habit, then, that, like, just from firsthand experience, you can make changes that matter to yourself on an individual level. And I don't know, I guess the media landscape, the proliferation of all types of media, again, just having it at our fingertips, along with that incentive of, if you're not paying attention, if you're not, keeping up with everything, then you're not really, you're not being a good ally, is maybe too narrow of a word to use, but there's just this endless supply of other things that are beyond our immediate sphere that I think are important to tend to, but they should, I don't know. It's like, I almost feel like I have to grow and expand my sphere of influence to be able to take care of myself and build up some excess so that I can share that with a larger sphere. And again, like, until those internal, the smaller concentric circle kind of idea in my head, until those the internal ones are met, then you're kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul by sending your attention and caring so much about something that's happening on the other side of the globe. And I don't really feel like that's a sustainable way to move forward.
No, I wholeheartedly agree. I'm a big fan of Stoic philosophy, which kind of saved my sanity at one point. And I want to get really vulnerable and honest for a few minutes here. And I wish this was the note we started on, because I'm not sure how much people want to hear me complain about woke people, as if we don't get enough of that already. Um, I'm in addiction recovery right now, and one of the things we say is accept the things we cannot change, um, which has been so odd for me from the Gen Z perspective, going from being very isolated and smoking 3 grams of weed a day over the summer, and feeling like I had no voice in these matters, to briefly interacting with some of my idols and getting some attention online in a very niche sphere. Nonetheless, I don't want to toot my own horn here, is really odd. And I think what we're looking at right now with the internet and Clubhouse in particular, I found it really funny, because when I was speaking to Eric, there were several people cutting him off who clearly didn't know who he was. And I found that so hilarious, where there's no gatekeeper effect anymore. And I think people under the boomer generation, maybe even some boomers, are noticing that legacy media is totally broken. And I don't know where we go from here now in that sense. And for me personally, in my surroundings and my companions, it seems that everyone lives in their own reality to some extent. It's really odd, and it's so catered by technology. And I don't recuse myself from this here. And particularly for us Gen Zers as well, we we all know how terrible it is, but then again, it's what I was getting at. We can't take a step back at this point. Our identities have been crafted by this, and the big concerns I have for our generation, which is something we wanted to speak on, or my generation, are substance use and porn addiction. There's a lot of talk about the crisis of masculinity, and again, I don't think any of the illiberal ideology does us men any good. Um, that every man I know my age, including myself, from our early teens, we were sexualized on abhorrent porn. And it's really weird how this goes on with the narrative, because some of the biggest porn addicts I know are also engaged in illiberalism, and how we're living in the era of consent, which is a good thing for a multitude of reasons. But meanwhile, if you go on any porn site, most of the porn is has very many undertones of rape and whatnot. So there's the neurology I'm not well versed enough on, but what it does to your brain is, yeah, I've read, I don't have a citation, is that the feedback loop is similar to a heroin addict's brain. And also, when it comes to actually engaging in sex, our minds have been so sexualized on this instance of viewership rather than participation. And if you just look at the rates of erectile dysfunction in people in their 20s relative to just a decade ago, that's something that deeply concerns me. I think the relationship between the sexes has splintered, and that's just one of many factors that isn't spoken about. And it has to do with third or fourth wave feminism and being sex positive. Like, how could you be against porn? And the other
Yeah.
thing I know is nearly everyone I grew up with, and we're from a very affluent area, is addicted to nicotine or marijuana or alcohol or maybe even pills. And I really don't know where we go from here. It's something that when I hear my parents speak, they had one or two burnouts from high school who got hooked on something, and everyone in the town knows them. I'm in one of the most affluent areas on the planet, and we have eighth graders overdosing on pills. That's new. And if
Yeah.
it's not new, it's only been going on in underprivileged areas. And no one seems to want to address these issues, politician or people themselves, because when I speak to other Gen Zers candidly about this, they'll make excuses for why porn isn't a bad thing. They'll make excuses for why constant substance use isn't a bad thing. And some of the brightest minds I know are doing acid on school nights and whatnot. And it's not that substance as a whole is bad. It's that the way it's at our fingertips and
The relationship with it. Yeah.
yeah, because it's very
Yeah.
culturally influenced, particularly through things like SoundCloud rap and whatnot. And I think the discussions no one is having is around marijuana, because I'm a marijuana legalization advocate. I came to
Same.
school here partly because marijuana is legal here, but merely telling people that I'm in addiction recovery for marijuana, they kind of like, because we've been met with this. It went from being fully stigmatized to being looked at as a miracle plant that could never harm you. And
The reality is
I
probably somewhere in the middle,
yeah,
as most things are. Yeah.
yeah. So those are the two big or the three big things would be social media, pornography, and addiction. And again, with social media, it's the catering of self-image and the celebritization of anyone. You don't need to have 20,000 followers to feel like a celebrity when you post things.
Yeah.
It's really quite odd. And I look at there being two spheres, this existential digital sphere and the sphere of reality. And for us younger folk, I'd say upwards of 40% of the time we exist in that existential online sphere.
Well,
With
that seems
lockdown, it may
low,
have, well,
actually,
yeah,
to
with
me.
lockdown, I would say it would go up to 70%.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, and then every now and then it boils out into the world. And we saw that with the Capitol riots. We saw that with how widespread BLM was. We see it with, it's just odd to me seeing 16-year-olds posting things online back home who were once apolitical, saying, if you're not marching, you're a racist.
Yeah.
And it's really jarring. And I think the narrative older generations can't even quite keep up with. So I want to see solutions around these things, but primarily just on the substance of addiction and porn discussion. Things like The Social Dilemma have been out on Netflix. Everyone knows how evil some of these networks are, but
Yeah.
no one I know is speaking about porn. And that's something that's ruined so many male psyche. And the last point I'll leave on at this is, with the idea of bashing the patriarchy and other, you know, uh, quite leftist ideas, has come this idea that monogamy as a whole is bad, and any heteronormative, more traditional relationship is bad. And it's really odd because I see people partaking in hookup culture, and I'm someone who's partaken in hookup culture myself. Like, get on an app, you schedule with someone you've never met, we're going to have sex at this time, and it is the most inhumane thing ever. And everyone knows it, but we go along with it because of this cultural norm. It's really quite odd. And that's what Eric was speaking about on Clubhouse the other night. Was he sees it in his son to some extent trying to dodge these things. And
Yeah.
again, it's not that things like casual sex, which personally I don't believe can even exist, or things like polyamory are inherently bad. It's that people want to push them as inherently good and anti-evil.
Or yeah, just absent of any downsides, I guess. Yeah. And I mean, some of that just is, I'm struck by the idea just like how big of a change can occur within this, 15-year time span, that kind of going back to just thinking of most of the conversations around porn when I was in college, or experiencing most of that, centered around the I guess the well-being of the participants, the actors, the actresses, and the well-being. And again, like you mentioned, we're coming at it now from kind of a widespread embrace of the sex positivity, and so it's less centered around that. But I think what you're getting at is an important kind of recognition of a need to talk about the long-term effects, and again, the effects on the user, the individual user. And even with the your summation of all three of these things, with social media, porn, and addiction was the way you phrased it, but substance addiction specifically, to me, all three of those, I think, and this kind of relies on a different model of addiction, but all three of those are within kind of the same thing. It's our relationship to these things that it's more and more difficult necessarily to recognize the dangers that we're self-inflicting, and that addictive behavior, that relationship that is just just rewarding the easy interaction, whether that's social media versus in person, having a conversation, like you said, on Twitter. Everybody who's spent any time on Twitter knows how vastly different that is from having a conversation in real life. Just like a sexual encounter in real life is much different than viewing it on porn. And I don't have necessarily a one-to-one analog for the drug use, but it is, there's I sense a lot of similarity and a lot of fundamental overlap with kind of all three of those topics, in terms of just how do we negotiate our relationship to these things that doesn't lead us down very unhealthy, very hard to self-regulate paths.
Yeah, certainly. It's paradoxical to me, because we have all this criticism from older generations about how soft and fragile we are, which is very true. I think we all need to toughen up a bit in my generation. But we're also really suffering in a lot of ways. I think I saw a recent poll that was 36% of Americans under 25 have seriously considered killing themselves during lockdown. That is astronomical.
Yeah.
More than 1/3. And we're really, and this is where I go back to the hierarchy of oppression and identity within my generation. Is we need to recognize that we're collectively suffering. You can point to any causal factors, and anyone who's been brought into this synthetic social media world, or has been raised on porn, or was smoking pot from a very young age nonstop, has a reason to feel pain and has a reason to cry out and say we're suffering. And I think a lot of people say, every generation has had their struggle, but our struggle is within us. It's generally not we've got climate change and other things, but I think our struggle just comes from a lack of accepting responsibility to some degree, which is why young men have gravitated to voices like Jordan Peterson, because it's not that we were never encouraged as children, but we were over encouraged and given these kind of bubblegum dreams, like, you'll be out there one day doing this, you'll be a rock star, and we were never encouraged for reality. And that's why so many people are breaking down right now. And it doesn't mean that there aren't victims. It means that there's a collective suffering going on that no one wants to talk about for tribal reasons generally.
Yeah. Or we kind of gatekeep. There is some amount of gatekeeping in terms of which versions of suffering are on the table for discussion, and that, again, like, you're leaving a lot of people behind that way, and which is unfortunate. And I don't know, I'm mindful of your time, so I know you've got some schoolwork to get to, and you've had a busy few days, and we'll definitely, I don't know, just want to kind of tie it up, but also just like give you a chance to I guess get the last word in. Is there, if you want people to seek you out on whatever platforms, or if you would prefer to just,
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at CGMWells and on Clubhouse as well. This Saturday, we're going to be having a follow-up room with several professors and Greg Ellis again. We're really looking forward to it. Yeah, I feel that I was a little rambly there and tangential first time on a podcast. So thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to speak with anyone in the Unity camp, because I was a big time advocate, and hopefully we can get something similar for the next election that actually takes off, and I will gladly be on the campaign trail for that.
Cool. Well, yeah, we appreciate you taking the time, and if it's any consolation, we've been doing this for 6, 7, 8, 9 months now almost. And I'm still susceptible to rambling. So as my teammates will clearly be able to attest, and most listeners. So no worries there, and you're welcome to come back. We appreciate having you on and giving this perspective, like I said, from the Gen Z crowd, which arguably, like, there's maybe not that much vocal or prominent vocalization of that. So we're happy to have you on and appreciate the time you're taking. Do you happen to know what time the Clubhouse room is this Saturday?
We're still hashing that out.
Okay.
Right
cool.
now, we're hoping for 8 p.m. East. However, things may change because we have some certain surprise guests we're trying to get in the room. So
Cool.
we're looking forward to it, but we're hoping for Saturday at 5 p.m. East Standard.
Cool. And anyone tuning in at any point in time over the weekend after that point in time may still get in, may still find a room that is highly active if this last one is any indication. So
Yes, certainly. Well, thank you
Cool.
so much for your time, Gabriel, and I look forward to speaking again sometime.
Of course. Thanks so much. This has been Unity Now. We'll be with you again next week. So thanks for tuning in.
To find more conversations and content like this, be sure to subscribe to Unity Now on all major podcasting platforms. If you prefer video format, you'll find our channel with full episodes and clips on YouTube.